Good evening, everybody. That works. Hello, thanks so much to everyone for coming out. My name is David Shayevitz, and I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Northwestern and director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight to the 2022 Philip and Ethel Klutznick Lecture in Jewish Civilization, which we're hosting in partnership with the Jewish United Fund of Chicago. Before kicking things off, allow me to just say a word or two about the Crown Family Center and to acknowledge some of the people who've made tonight's event possible. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies is an academic hub for undergraduate and graduate education, innovative faculty and student research, and accessible and engaging public programming. Our students, affiliated faculty members, and visiting professors and postdoctoral fellows study, teach, and research Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. The Crown Family Center is comprised of over a dozen affiliated full-time faculty members, a robust group of visiting scholars and postdoctoral fellows, and dozens, an undergraduate major, 2 minors, an interdisciplinary graduate cluster, and dozens of annual courses that enroll hundreds of students. Part of what makes the Crown Family Center unique among the university's many departments and programs and centers is our dedication to communal engagement and to building bridges between the university and the wider public. And maybe the best example of this community-facing mission is our long-standing partnership with the Jewish United Fund of Metropolitan Chicago, with whom we are co-hosting tonight's event. Our partnership with the Federation includes an annual postdoctoral fellowship in Israel Studies, funded by the Jewish Federation, which brings young scholars from Israel to Evanston to study and teach about modern Israel. We also work closely on campus with Northwestern's Hillel, an affiliate of the Federation, in order to connect students' classroom experiences with their campus communal lives. And for the last 35 years, the Federation and Northwestern have partnered to host a public lecture which would highlight the very best of academic Jewish studies in ways that are accessible and engaging, and which speak not only to the long history of Jewish civilization, but also to its impact upon the present and future of the Jewish world. And before I introduce tonight's speaker in that series, I want to briefly turn things over to my friend Paula Harris, Associate Vice President at the JUF of Chicago, to say a few words. Paula.
Thank you, David. Well, David stole my thunder and said everything I was going to say, except I just want to give greetings on behalf of the Jewish United Fund and let you know that this partnership with Northwestern University, as David said, is really long-standing, and we're really thrilled to be able to do the many programs with Northwestern. I think it's just a really strong partnership, and we know that the intent of Northwestern University is to really support Jewish institutions on campus, but also Jewish students, and make them an integral part of the campus community. So, on behalf of JUF, I'm thrilled that you're here. I'm very excited to hear Laura's presentation. I love history, and I think this is just going to be terrific. So thank you all for coming. And now I'm going to hand it back over to David.
Thank you. Okay, let me just say 2 quick words, 2 quick announcements before we move into the main part of tonight's event. The first is just a word of thanks to Nancy Gelman and Katie Genio, the 2 administrative resources, brainchilds, superheroes who made tonight's event possible, and all of the events that we sponsor here for the Crown Family Center. So we're so grateful to them. The second announcement is that there will be a reception right around the corner in room 101 immediately following the talk. So we'll have a lecture, some time for Q&A, and then time for some more informal conversation and refreshments. Our speaker tonight is Professor Laura Arnold Leibman, who's Professor of English and Humanities at Reed College. She's a scholar of early American Jewish history, primarily in the colonial and revolutionary periods, and her work explores the fascinating ways in which material culture, that is, physical objects, change our understanding of the role of women, children, and Jews of color in the early Atlantic world. Now, I think most scholars would be happy over the course of their academic careers to write one book that really revolutionizes a field. Professor Leibman has written 3 of these in the past decade. Her first book, which appeared in 2012, Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism, A New Interpretation of Early American Jewish Life, was awarded a Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association for Jewish Studies and the National Jewish Book Award. That's going to be the first in a trend, by the way, so pay attention. That book was a revisionary account of the spiritual and social lives of Jews in the early Americas, which ranged widely across the Caribbean to the colonial United States, and used evidence ranging from written archives to Jewish mystical ideas to surviving gravestones. And in all of these ways, the book revealed the inner lives and quotidian experiences of everyday Jews whose histories have long been neglected by scholars. Her second book, The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects, which appeared in 2020, won 3 National Jewish Book Awards, which I think is a record, and continues in the same vein in terms of scholarship and methodology. Using 5 objects owned by women, rich and poor, religious and non, she unveils facets of Jewish women's lives and family lives in early America, and the ways in which family histories can serve as a prism for broader developments in Jewish history writ large. I don't say this about many academic books, but this book, like all of hers, is really beautifully written. I would highly recommend it to anyone, scholar or layperson. And it was that 2020 book that inspired this invitation, and I guess we thought that that was going to be the topic that we would hear about. And yet, just a year later, in 2021, a third book appeared, and it's the one that we're going to be hearing about tonight, Once We Were Slaves, which is a book about an early multiracial Jewish family who began their lives enslaved in the Caribbean and went on to become some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. This book, too, was a finalist for last year's National Jewish Book Award. And these 3 books are really just the tip of the iceberg of a prolific and very influential career. Dozens of articles, edited collections, leadership roles in scholarly organizations, much more that I'll spare you because my introduction has already gone too long. But suffice it to say that it's a real honor and a privilege to welcome here tonight, Professor Laura Leibman.
Thank you. Okay, Zidane, I dropped it part way. And somehow we lost the images right as I was walking up. Let's see if we can get them back. No. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started a little bit as we're getting them back on the screen. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be in the greater Chicagoland. I'm somebody who has lived in Chicago at various points in my life and has a family that's from Chicago, so it's really sweet to be here, and in particular at Northwestern, which, as I was explaining to Claire, I have an identical twin in this. Her first job was at Northwestern, so I feel like, wah, back in the homeland. So I'm going to start tonight with a pair of siblings who are at the heart of my story, and their names are Sarah Brandon Moses and Isaac Lopez Brandon, and they were born at the end of the 18th century on the island of Barbados, and they started their lives enslaved, and so hence quite poor, Christian, and by the end of their lives, or by the end of Sarah's life, less than 30 years later, had become some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. And over the course of their travels around the Atlantic world, the couple had their race reassigned from having first been identified as people of color to when they lived in New York as being considered members of the white Jewish community. So tonight I really want to talk to you about their larger history and the history of their family for 3 main reasons. One is I hope you'll remember just something about the pair of siblings, because I think they're a great example of how sometimes people who aren't particularly famous during their own lifetimes are nevertheless fascinating from the perspective of our day looking backwards. Second, I'm hoping that you'll take away something about how Jews and race are related during this key period in American history. So, as I mentioned, Sarah and Isaac had their race reassigned or changed over the course of their lifetimes. And most of the time when we think about not just Jews, but people in general who are racially ambiguous and have multiple racial designations, they've been considered under what's called passing. And some of you have may even seen the Netflix show called Passing that came out fairly recently. And what I want to emphasize tonight is that for Jews like Sarah and Isaac, passing was never an option. So passing is this idea that somehow people are born into a specific race, but if they move somewhere else, they could hide that race from and that knowledge from people's understanding of them and somehow be understood as belonging to another race. And for Sarah and Isaac and other Jews in the Atlantic world, that just wasn't possible because every single place they went, there were members of the Barbadian Jewish community that they lived among. So every place that they went, people knew their backstory of having been born enslaved and having had African ancestors. In spite of that, their racial assignment changed as they moved from place to place. So I feel like this is a really wonderful example to help us understand how race was a much more slippery thing than many of us have understood it to be from this time period. So that's the second thing I hope you'll take away from tonight. The third thing has to do with that larger history of multiracial Jews in the Americas and in the United States in particular. And some of you may have heard that a number of Jewish federations and organizations have done surveys of American Jewish communities and found that when you ask people about questions about race, that a much larger percent of Jews identify as non-white or as multiracial than many people might have expected. And that percent of Jewish communities ranges it sort of on the low end from maybe 9% up to about 25% of Jewish communities, particularly on the West Coast. But most of the time when we talk about that history of multiracial Jews, we tend to talk about it as happening sort of after the 1970s, as if it's a recent phenomenon. And I really want to get at, through the story of Sarah and Isaac and their descendants, how that's a much longer history, and that we should push our understanding of the impact of race and multiracial Jews on American Jewish history much farther back in time. So with those three things in mind, I want to begin where Sarah and Isaac's lives began, and that is in the southeastern part of the Caribbean on the island of Barbados. Sarah and Isaac were born in the 1790s, and their father was by the end of his life, the wealthiest Jew on the island, a man named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, who was a member of the Portuguese Jewish community. Their mother, in contrast, however, was somebody who had gone by a variety of different names, and she, like her children, was born enslaved. She was somebody who sometimes went by the name Sarah Lopez, sometimes by Esther Lopez Gill, and sometimes by Sarah Esther. And fortunately, her father mentioned that she had all these multiple names in his will. Otherwise, I would have been like, is this the same person? And fortunately, he identified, yes, it is. And she had that last name Lopez, not because she was born into the Lopez family, but because she was born enslaved to them. And that's where her children, for example, Isaac Lopez Brandon, got his middle name from that family that had enslaved them. Well, the siblings' father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, had a number of plantations along the western coast of the island. The children weren't actually born on one of those plantations, nor was their mother. They were instead born in the main port of Bridgetown, and they were born along a street called Swan Street. So if you can sort of see behind here, it says, or Jew Street. That's because a lot of Jews lived along Swan Street. And it was one of the main shopping streets in Bridgetown during this time period. And you can see that it's actually located very near to the Nida Israel Synagogue, which is the main congregation for the island during this time period. And in fact, both the siblings' father, Abraham, and their enslavers, the Lopez family, both belonged to this congregation, the Nida Israel Synagogue. And throughout his life, their father was not only a member of the congregation, but sat on the Ma'amad, the governance board, and at times was the Parnas, or president of the congregation. So he's really an important member of the Jewish community, both religiously and economically. In contrast, contrast, the family that enslaved Sarah and Isaac and their mother was kind of middling Jews. They weren't super wealthy, they weren't super poor, they were kind of in the middle of things. And they were, instead of having these grand plantation houses, they lived in one of these two-story buildings along Swan Street that we see in a late 19th century photograph, where there would be a store downstairs and then upstairs would be this small apartment with a balcony overlooking the street. And we know that the family had at least two different stores along Swan Street. One was a silversmith or goldsmith store run by one of the children in the family, and the other was, I'll go back for a second, the other was a sort of every goods store. So they were merchants, but not like merchants who own big sailing ships, but merchants who own like a store where you could buy ribbons, if that makes any sense. So like very much a kind of middle class family. And when it came time to register her children's birth, the siblings' mother took Sarah not to the synagogue, but instead to the local church for this particular parish. And that today is known as St. Michael's Cathedral, but at the time was St. Michael's Church. And her reasons for doing this were important. First, she really didn't have the option of registering them at the synagogue, because during this time period, people had to be halakhically, that is legally, according to Jewish law, members of the Jewish community in order to have their births registered there. And since her mother and all of her mother's line went back to Africa, they were not considered halakhically Jewish. And there were very few conversions on the island. So it wasn't really an option that they could convert and join the community, or that her mother could have done that. So that was the first reason why she has to bring her to the church if she wants to have the birth recorded. The second reason, however, is that by bringing her to the church, she's actually protecting her daughter in really crucial ways. So during this time period, if you wanted to have a religious wedding, you had to be baptized by the church or be a member of the synagogue, which we know they couldn't. And that kind of religious wedding could protect her daughter from having to be used as for other purposes by the people that owned her. So there's really an important way in which having access to a baptism and the registry at the church allows her to protect her daughter and allows her to potentially one day have a marriage that her mother, their grandmother, their great-grandmother, none of them were able to have. So a really important gesture of protection from the mother's side of things. On the other hand, however, by registering her daughter and getting her baptized, there's still the same font there at the church where she was baptized in, she also had to have her be submitted to the church's understanding of race. So when you registered a child at the church and had them baptized, the church was the place that marked down what race you were. And so from her very early days, Sarah's marked down as being multiracial, or a person of color. And had she stayed on the island, that never would have changed. They had something similar to what we would consider the one-drop rule, which is if you had any African ancestors for your entire life, you would always be considered a person of color. And that designation would limit what sorts of civil opportunities you had. So on the one hand, protective, on the other hand, very much limits what she can do in her life on the island. And so for the first few years of their lives, the children grew up living along Swan Street, upstairs in this small apartment, being part of this family that was helping take care of and earn money for the Lopez family without any remuneration for themselves. And then in 1801, when Sarah was just 3 years old and her brother was just about 9 years old, two really life-changing things happened. The first of which was a little bit sad, which was their mother's white Anglican father died. And he passed away and left the family a church, a house nearby, near Back Church Street. And this was incredibly unusual for this time period, that most white men who had children by women of color would not leave, they had no legal obligation to those children, and they would not leave anything of what they had accumulated to those children. It would instead go to their white siblings or their nieces and nephews, of which we know the grandfather definitely had some. And he does something very remarkable, which is he goes against the typical policy on the island, and he leaves a couple of houses to different families that he's had by 2 different women of color. So suddenly, Sarah and Isaac's mother and her brothers go from being people who are considered property themselves to people who own property. So a really radical change in terms of what's possible in their lives. In addition, the location of that house ended up being very useful for the family because it was located near where there had been the original church that had been blown down in one of the many, many hurricanes. And very shortly after they inherited the house would be built St. Mary's Church, which is where the elite, the wealthiest free people of color attended services. And so the very location of the house, unbeknownst to the grandfather, really sets up the family to sort of rise up in social status and to become part of this insider group. It was also located, however, very near where would be built the Methodist congregation shortly after they inherited the property. And this is where the strategies that I used for writing this history became really, really crucial. When I started working on the family, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just tracing their father's line and figuring out his genealogy and where they had come from, but also that I was tracing what their mother's family, as far back as I could, where they were from and where they had lived. And this ended up being really, really important because the siblings, it turns out, were related to the most famous woman in early Barbadian history. So she's a woman named, later gets called Sarah Ann Gill, but during her lifetime was called Ann Jordan Gill, and she's the first female national hero of Barbados. And she gets that designation because of using the Methodist Church in order to get rights for free and enslaved people of color. So she's really crucial in terms of activism on the island. And this would end up being very interesting for the history that I was noticing amongst Sarah and her brother, because her brother also ends up being very involved in using religion to gain civil rights, but on behalf of Jews. So we could really see this sort of back and forth between the 2 sides and their family. So just to go forward for a second, kind of clear up who I've been talking about so far. Here's Sarah, here's her brother Isaac. They had 2 other sisters who appear in the early records and then kind of drop out and disappear, and so we assume they died as children. This is their mother, Sarah Esther Gill, their father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. Their mother had 3 brothers, one of whom married this very famous national hero of Barbados. And I was able to trace back not only their mother, but also their grandmother, Jemima Lopez, and actually another generation back that we don't see here, to a woman named Deborah Lopez. Deborah, Jemima, Sarah, William, Jonathan, Alexander, and all these children down here were all enslaved to that same Lopez family. So while they didn't have a lot of other income, they were gaining a lot of income off of this particular family that was enslaved to them. And then here's that grandfather that died, and he had not only the family with Jemima, but also with another woman who was involved, whose daughter was involved in the Methodist Church as well. So that was the first crucial thing that happened that just radically set their lives apart from most of the people enslaved on the island of Barbados. They happened to inherit property from a white relation. The second thing, however, was that their father took them back to that church, St. Michael's Church, in 1801, and paid the Lopez family to have his children freed, and paid the church to make sure that they would always remain free for the rest of their lives. And again, this was just incredibly unusual in terms of the history of enslaved people on the island. Very atypical that people would be freed in this fashion. The vast majority of people who were enslaved across the island, let alone in Bridgetown, would have to wait until 1834 in order for the general emancipation to free people people across the island. So when we're thinking about somebody like Isaac, that means instead of being freed at the age of 9, he would have been well into his 40s by the time that he got freed. Similarly for Sarah, she would have been not only an adult, but it would have had all of her children who also would have been born enslaved just as she was. So it's not just freeing her and Isaac, but the children that are descended through Sarah as well. So again, incredibly unusual, not typical of what happened on the island. And without those two things, their story would have been extremely different. So after these two radical events in 1801, they're living in and amongst the people who are free and enslaved around that sweet street of Swan Street here, near the synagogue, near the two churches. And like many of those people had sort of ties to various different religious organizations. But in terms of the synagogue, we're always at the margins of it because of that rule of not allowing people to be converted. And they might have continued on like the dozens of other people in this similar situation had it not been that in 1811, Isaac decided enough is enough. And he decided that he didn't want to be always at the margins of the Jewish community. He had a religious awakening just like his Methodist aunt, but instead of wanting to become Methodist, he wanted to be a Jew. And so in 1811, Isaac took his younger sister and left the island of Barbados, where there were no chances of becoming converted to Judaism, and they traveled south to the nearby colony of Suriname. Now, today, probably most of you wouldn't go to Suriname to convert to Judaism, so it's probably worth saying, like, why? Why would they go to Suriname other than it's nearby? So during this time period, the two largest Jewish communities in all of the Americas were not in New York or in Philadelphia, but rather in this little peanut-shaped island called Curacao off the coast of Venezuela, and in this colony of Suriname. And they had much larger, much better infrastructure than any of the other Jewish communities in the Americas. So a much more obvious choice of where to go to convert. And you can notice they're about equal distant. So one other thing that's important to know is that Suriname, in distinction from Curacao and almost anywhere else in the Americas, has the largest multiracial Jewish community of anywhere in the Americas. So in that sense is positioned to be a much more welcoming place for people such as Sarah and Isaac, who have one Jewish parent and one parent who was born enslaved. So when the siblings come to Suriname, they come to the main port of Paramaribo, but the reason for that history of that multiracial Jewish community really lies downriver in this town called Yoden Savannah, or Jews Savannah, which had been set up during the 17th century as the first semi-autonomous Jewish town in the Americas. And it was a place where Jews were very actively trying to follow the laws of the Bible, including some of the laws regarding how you should be treating enslaved people, such as needing to convert them and needing to circumcise them, particularly, sort of not everybody, but particularly if they happen to have a Jewish father. So because of that, by the time that Sarah and Isaac arrive in Paramaribo, there has been a history of a community with people who have African ancestors who've been part of this community for over 100 years, right? So a very diverse community, and scholars such as Aviva Ben-Ur have estimated that by 1811, over half of the community would have had at least one African ancestor. So much more diverse than even most communities in the United States today. So in that main port, when Sarah and Isaac come there, they actually have not one synagogue where they can go, but an opportunity to go to a couple different synagogues, and they choose particularly to go to the Portuguese synagogue. And this kind of makes sense because their father is a Portuguese Jew, so they have an inside track. But it also makes sense because Portuguese Jews, or Sephardic Jews as we would probably call them today, were the classy Jews. So if you had a choice of which kind of Jewish community to belong to, you would probably want to choose the Portuguese community. And it's sort of as evidence of this, Mordecai Manuel Noah, who's an early, and 3 of them are Ashkenazi, but if anybody ever asks him whether he's Sephardic or Ashkenazi, he's always like, Sephardic, because it's the classy thing to be, right? So very much a status thing to belong to that congregation. And some of you may have seen the interior of the synagogue because it's now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, so sort of is famous beyond Suriname as well. And Isaac came before the Ma'amad, who would have sat in these particular seats over to the side, and he requested permission to not only convert to Judaism, but to become circumcised, and was given permission. And the siblings then, he went through the circumcision process, and then afterwards, the siblings, one by one, went to this small building right behind where the synagogue was, where more recently there was a kiddush would have been held in this building, but there's also a trap door sort of here, and that trap door led downstairs, and this would have been filled with water at the time, and there was a ritual bath, and so both siblings would have gone down one by one, and would have immersed in the bath, and that would have completed their conversion, and they would have come back up, now recognized not only by this community, but Jewish communities around the Atlantic world as being part of the Jewish people. Sometimes I'll get asked by people, is the Surinamese conversion considered a good conversion during this time period? And the answer is yes. We find when people go from Philadelphia or New York to London or Amsterdam, they get given grief about their conversions from those places, but not from Suriname. So considered a good conversion during this time period. So I mentioned that they had a choice of where to convert, and indeed around the corner was a congregation that had originally, the building had originally belonged to the Sephardic community, and it had become overrun by those not as classy Ashkenazi or High German Jews, and so the Sephardic Jews sold the building to them, and they had another community around the corner. And I think it's really important to understand the sort of level at which there were divides between these two communities. So when you look at the records for how the Sephardic Jews talked about the Ashkenazi Jews, not only here, but in Amsterdam or London, the same word that you would use for an Ashkenazi Jew, Tedesco, would also mean like a servant. So it really is very much a class divide between the two communities, such that if a man from that Sephardic community married a woman from this community, he would be demoted and no longer allowed to come up to the Torah or to have honors in the synagogue. So they're really very contrary to Jewish law, trying to keep the communities as separate as possible. In addition, however, both of those two congregations also discriminated against Jews who they considered Jews of color. So this is a particular marriage contract between two Jews who were considered Jews of color during this time period. And this is where knowing something about how race differed in Suriname is really important to understanding what's going on in both the siblings' lives and in terms of the politics of these particular congregations. So I had mentioned in Barbados, if you had any African ancestry, you were always legally a person of color. Not so in Suriname. In Suriname, if 7 out of your 8 great-grandparents were from Europe or of European descent, you could either be considered a person of color or white. So if your parents were legally married, you are white. If your parents were not legally married, you were considered a person of color. And if your parents legally married after you were born, your race would change from being a person of color to being white. So again, a real difference there. So we have some of the people, because within the community, who have African ancestors are still white according to Jewish law. And one of the things that we see the Jewish community in Suriname doing in order to sort of grapple with these race politics that are going on around them is they start adapting Jewish rituals in ways that are completely contrary to Jewish law. And those are particularly seen around the marriages. So I had mentioned that this was a ketubah of 2 people who were understood by the community as being not white. And we know this because they put their racial designation into the marriage contract itself. So again, not what is supposed to happen, but is what's being done in Suriname because of this way in which marriage and race are connected. And the way that they did that was interesting in that a lot of times the Jewish colonial documents, it will talk about people of African ancestry using kind of biblical terms like they're Cushites, some other group. That's not what happens here. They don't make them some other race. They still think of them as Jews. They're just emancipated Jews. So there's this term of emancipated Jews, and they're signaling they or somebody in their families had once been enslaved. So not a separate race, but still stigmatized. And this particular group of people who were considered Jews of color or the emancipated Jews were, like the people who married across the congregations, given a second-class status in the synagogue. So they could not be buried in the good part of the cemetery. They would be buried in the swampy part. You could only sit in the bad seats in the synagogue. You couldn't be called up to the Torah for honors, and on and on and on. So really, all these sorts of ways of continuing to stigmatize people and to have prejudice against them within the community. And I think this can help us understand why, although there's this inclusion where Sarah and Isaac can convert in Suriname, why they may have not wanted to stay in Suriname. Because we know from the records from Suriname, their parents clearly did not marry because they are considered people of color according to the Surinamese census. But if they had ever married somebody who wasn't considered a person of color, that person would have been demoted, and they also would have always had this sort of marginal status within the congregations. So it's important to understand that they aren't the only people to have noticed that this was a problem in Suriname. In fact, very early on in the 18th century, the Jews who are the emancipated Jews try and break away and form their own community, their own siva or brotherhood called Darhe Yeshurim. And that was located here on that intersection near Siva Plain. And this is a place where they can practice Judaism as fully as they want to, without any of those kinds of stigmas. And slowly over the course of the 18th century, they decide, you know what, we could just be a full synagogue. We don't even have to deal with all those other stigmas against us. And they try to legally become a synagogue, and unfortunately the European-led Jewish congregations clamp down on them and ask them to be disbanded by the colonial government. And the members of Darhe Yeshurim petitioned them to the colonial government that prejudice against us is illegal according to Surinamese law, which it was. And unfortunately, the colonial government sides with the European Jewish community. So by the time that Sarah and Isaac come to Suriname, Darhe Yeshurim has been disbanded completely, and they've rejoined those two European communities. So that's why the siblings don't end up converting at Darhe Yeshurim. It would be a very different story. So shortly after the conversion, the siblings decide Suriname is not the place we want to stay for the rest of our lives, and they decide, in spite of all the opportunities that are there, to leave. And Isaac goes back to Barbados, where, as I mentioned, he gets involved in a number of the civil rights disputes, in particular in the Jewish community. I talk a lot about those in the book. I'm not going to go into detail about them here, but I'm happy to talk about it in the question and answer. If you have questions, it does not end well for Isaac. He ends up getting kicked out of the Barbadian synagogue as a result. So I'll leave that little tantalizing bit there and instead follow his sister, who doesn't return to Barbados, but instead, with her father's help, travels north to the city of London. And this is a place where, if we thought Suriname was better than Barbados in terms of having a larger Jewish community, this is exponentially larger, and yet still centered around that same Sephardic congregation, that sort of the mothership of a lot of the communities like in Barbados, Bevis, Marks, and London. So they still have this Portuguese Jewish home that they can land in. But for Sarah, she ends up not staying right in London proper, but but goes slightly south of the city to where there's a couple of elite Sephardic boarding schools. And it's here that she's able to get the kind of education that the wealthiest Jews in the Atlantic world hope to give their children. So she's kind of brushing elbows with members of the Montefiore family and other really wealthy Jews, not only in London, but people who had been sent their children back to London from the West Indies. And at this particular school, she would have learned really important things. Not just languages, she would have learned Spanish and Portuguese and a little bit of Hebrew. Those are the languages she would need for synagogue, as well as a little bit of French, because that's what fancy people learned. But she also would learn how to give charity as opposed to be a recipient of charity. So really important for British class society during this time period. And she would learn how to manage a household of servants rather than being a servant herself. So in many ways, this transformation that she undergoes at the boarding school is just as crucial for her new life as an accepted member of the elite of the Jewish communities in the Atlantic world as her conversion was. And it's also while she's in London that she gets that cute little miniature painting painted of her. And these miniatures are very, very small. They're only about 2 3/4 inches tall by 2 1/4 inches wide. And they're made out of very fine materials. So they're very thin slices of ivory tusk from elephants and then painted in watercolor. And these portraits are extremely expensive. You can imagine how hard it is to paint something in that much detail if it's that small, and they cost about the same as a full-length oil painting would cost during this time period, but very popular among Atlantic world Jews. So one of the reasons why they're so popular is they're an important part of marriage rituals for during this time period for the people who had money. Because you can imagine if I live very far away from other Jews, I could send a little portrait on ahead to see if maybe you'd be interested in my daughter, right? So it's a way of sort of making these alliances across large distances, as well as once an alliance has been made, of having that sort of emotional appeal. They're definitely portraits that are supposed to be intimate. And one of the things that I was very interested in for both Sarah and Isaac's portraits was the way in which they engaged in this discussion of whiteness that's going on during this time period. This is definitely a moment when increasingly people are thinking about not just class, but race as being at the center of elite identities. And those ivory miniatures are very much an art form, unlike oil paintings, which have this kind of magical whiteness at the center of them. And you can see some of this going on in Isaac's portrait, where large portions of the ivory don't even have paint on them, and instead you have this sort of light coming in through the ivory. Sometimes there'll even be a little piece of silver. The light will bounce back and come back, and you get this kind of magical glow coming through the ivory. So a really crucial part of the miniatures is this association with elite white status. And for Sarah in particular, I was very interested how her miniature differed from other multiracial women who lived in the Atlantic world during this time period. This is a portrait of a young multiracial woman from Suriname and a young multiracial woman from New York who had been born in Haiti. And in both of them, we see the miniature makers doing exactly what all the manuals for miniature makers tell them never to do, which is to get the paint to stick. You either had to do little dots or little hatching marks, and then typically the hatching marks would be for things where you wanted to have texture, like clothing or hair. And here you can see they've put the hatching marks on the women's skin, which leaves them looking scratchy. Like if this were my miniature, I would have said redo it, please. I'm not paying for that, because this is definitely the bias of the miniature maker coming in and trying to sort of imply that somehow the women's skin is defective in some way. It's not how you're supposed to make these miniatures. And we know from other portraits during this time period, it wasn't necessary to do that. So we really see kind of racial bias going on here. In contrast, Sarah's miniature maker pays attention to how he's supposed to do the portraits and does not use those sorts of strategies. He uses the scratchiness, the hatching marks, exactly where he's supposed to on the background or on her lovely little curly hair and on her dress. So we see that sort of emphasis that she's part of this emergent glowing whiteness during this time period. Shortly after her portrait is made, her miniature meets another miniature at Bevis Marks, and a match is set. And the miniature that she meets belongs to a gentleman named Joshua Moses, who happened to be in town from New York in the textile trade. And like her family, Joshua Moses was the son of a really important merchant. His father is the wealthiest merchant, Jewish merchant in New York, as opposed to in Barbados. And he really is somebody where the matches is as much between the fathers-in-law as it is between the two people in general. And we see this based on how much Sarah's father puts into this particular marriage, because he decides to give her a dowry, not of a small amount, but of 10,000 pounds. So some of you, that number 10,000 pounds, you may remember from Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy has 10,000 pounds a year. And you may have wondered, like, is that a lot of money? And the answer is yes, that is a huge amount of money. It's about $30 million worth of purchasing money today. So just a huge amount for her to have as a dowry. By way of contrast, Joshua's mother had what was considered a phenomenal dowry, and it was not even 1,000 pounds, it was $1,000. So like 10 times less, more than 10 times less than what Joshua gets from Sarah's father. So that in and of itself like has the sign of like her father really sees this as a way of continuing his Jewish family going forward. In addition, however, really important that in some ways, had they been married 15 years earlier, probably this marriage would not have been possible to have had at Bevis Marks. But not because Sarah wasn't good enough, but because Joshua wouldn't have been good enough. And that's because he's one of those lowly Ashkenazi Jews. So he definitely is not only getting a huge amount of money and a super cute girl, as you remember from the portrait from this marriage, but also is marrying up in terms of Jewish status in the Jewish Atlantic world. And we know from the London contract, his marriage contract, there's no mention of enslavement here. It's very much not like Suriname. It just mentions that she's a member of the Portuguese nation. So she's a convert, but a member of the Portuguese nation. So really emphasizing her status through the Jewish side of her family. Shortly after they get married, they end up renting a house right over by Tower Hill, close to the docks where where Joshua works. And within the first year of their marriage, she's already pregnant with their first child, and they decide to leave London, give up on living there, and instead move back to the Americas. And they decide to settle not in Barbados, but instead in New York, where Joshua's family lives. And they settle on the lower part of Manhattan. Here is Joshua's parents' house. Here's the early synagogue. Here is Sarah and Joshua's house. And within a year, Isaac and their mother end up moving north from Barbados. I'd mentioned he'd gotten kicked out of the Barbadian synagogue. He comes north to New York with their mother. He ends up not only becoming Joshua's business partner, but also marries Joshua's sister, becomes not only a voting member of the congregation, but through the help of the family that he married into, becomes a naturalized citizen of the United States. So something that would not be possible for somebody considered a person of color during this time period. So he's being recognized within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community as being completely white, even though there are members of the community who, including Joshua, who went to Talmud Torah with their enslavers' grandchildren. So it's not because people don't know what's going on, but rather, again, like in London, the Jewish part of their story is trumping the other parts of their lineage. By the time she reaches 30, Sarah passes away, but she has had not one but 10 children she had 2 sets of twins, which I'm always like, still it seems like she must have been constant. Like when I was writing this, I was like, and Sarah's pregnant again, and she's pregnant again. Like she's constantly pregnant. Very much a sign of the ways in which her generation had been taken into the New York community in spite of the racism in the New York community at the time, accepted as Jews. One of her sons becomes the president of the congregation. One becomes one of the founders of the Jewish hospital and a Civil War hero. Others fight in the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. And one ends up marrying the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Satius, the most famous early Hazan or rabbi of the congregation. And it's really through this marriage that most of the descendants who are alive today come from Sarah. One of the things that really fascinated me was how mobile even that next generation remains. So that early mobility that's possible through the family's finances and through that sort of racial ambiguity allows them to not only take part in the gold rush, they settle over in Texas along the border. They are involved in the Civil War. 3 of the brothers are off in Canton involved in trade. 2 of them even go down to Nicaragua and try and overthrow the Nicaraguan government. They're really just all over the place. So again, very much benefiting from that previous generation's mobility. Even though Isaac, as an adult, when he goes back to Barbados for work, he's still considered a person of color. Barbados, person of color, comes back to New York, member of the white community again. So we see that sort of mobility, but the precariousness. Similarly, the son who ends up going to medical school in New York, he's allowed into medical school as a Jew. Had his African ancestry been known, he would have been kicked out, and we know because there's a similar case that happens around the same time. So they're really benefiting from that ability for the family to be able to be mobile and to challenge and move up against some of the different racial boundaries during this time period. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop there, and I'm hoping people have some questions for me. Do you want the microphone back? Okay, sure.
Are you okay fielding your own question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So we've got a few microphones going around. Please just raise your hands.
First, I'd like to thank you for explaining my family to me. My sister-in-law, who's a very Orthodox Jew living in Israel, married a very black man who is an Orthodox Jew born in Suriname. And he was raised as a non-Jew, and in his 40s he converted. So my question is something strange about Suriname that creates this kind of Weltanschauung where converting to Orthodoxy is like normal?
So I think one thing that's really important to understand, there's a lot of different strains of Judaism sort of coming into how people identify as Jewish in Suriname, and also really important that they aren't the only people who've been to Suriname that come to the US. Suriname becomes the sort of feeder of most of the rabbis of a certain generation in the 19th century in the United States. So we have a lot of people coming north from Suriname who are either part of or at the margins of the Jewish community. So one of the things that's distinctive about Suriname is there's a large community of people called Maroons early on, who are people who are a descendant of people who had been enslaved, who escaped and formed their own autonomous communities across Suriname. And a number of those Maroon communities identify as having Jewish ancestry, either through the history of slavery in Suriname or dating back to Africa, from the part of Africa that they came from, that they identify oral traditions of coming to the Americas already Jewish. And that's something that was very interesting to me about Sarah and Isaac's descendants. If you look at where their family is from DNA tests in Africa, they're also from that same part of Africa that identified as having a very early Jewish community. So a number of people who are part of who have Maroon ancestry very much come into the 20th century and to the contemporary period as having this understanding of themselves as Jewish that may be counter to how people outside of Suriname are understanding Jewishness, but is really important for Surinamese identity across a large time period. And very important, I would say, for US history in terms of starting by the 1920s, that you start to have a large number of African American synagogues popping up in Harlem and in other cities. And a large number of people in those congregations are people who've come north from Suriname and the Caribbean and other places and actually do have this long-standing history of Judaism. So again, I don't know about the particular history of the person that you're mentioning, but there is a lot of different avenues to Jewishness in Suriname over the course of its history.
Thank you.
Sure.
Was marriage to a colored woman the norm among Jewish middle-class men in Suriname? And can you talk about the slave ownership of Jews who lived in the West Indies?
Yeah, so it's a really important question of whether it was typical that people, if they were having a relationship with a woman of color in Suriname, would there be a marriage? And the answer is actually no early on, that there's something called a Surinamese marriage, which is a form of concubinage. And some of those issues that I was talking about in the discrimination within the synagogues sort of discouraged people from actually having a legal Jewish marriage and instead doing the concubinage. So that was from the men's side, that I know of a number of families where the man did marry the woman that he had had many children with and a long-standing relationship with, and then he loses his status in the synagogue. So somebody who had been the parnas of the congregation now no longer can be called up to the Torah even, or be a voting member of the congregation. So really important that discrimination is keeping people very actively from legally marrying people. From the women's side of things, when you marry in early America, you give up a lot of autonomy and a lot of control of your finances. And so we actually do see records early on of women also saying the legal marriages are not helpful because now they don't actually own any of the things that they owned before. So a number of women who have these Surinamese marriages have quite a bit of resources which they no longer have control over if they are legally married. So it's complicated. In terms of the history of slavery, what kinds of things what in particular are you interested in? Sorry.
Well, we're the Jews who live there doing the same thing that other white people did in their business affairs.
Yeah, so
the economic model.
Yeah. So I would say yes, we do have that one particular plantation or labor camp town of Yoden Savannah, which is mainly Jewish run. There's a lot of early documents from Suriname saying the Jews are the worst of the slave owners. Usually the people writing those seem to have some agenda against Jews, and then the Jews will say, like, no, we're the best people at enslaving people, we're the kindest. And I feel like that's not really a high moral ground on some level, right? Like we could aim for something better than like being really good at enslaving people or nice to people we enslave. So I feel like the evidence seems to suggest their history of slavery is very similar. There was a period in American Jewish history where people sort of were responding against some of the criticism from the Nation of Islam that the Jews were essential to the slave trade and were responsible for the slave trade. And people went through and did number crunching of like, and proportionally no, but I think at this point we sort of recognize those sorts of statements are more about trying to ask Jews to be accountable for what went on in history as opposed to number crunching. Does that make sense? So I feel like, again, just thinking about what are the ways in which even within Jewish communities, people are discriminating against other Jews, I think is really important for us going forward to think about how does behavior that's contrary to Jewish law continue during this time period? How can that help us understand the ways in which people unintentionally perpetuate things today or intentionally perpetuate things today, and sort of as a starting point for thinking about doing things differently, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Mike.
Yeah.
Did the Jews in Suriname especially follow biblical laws regarding the freeing of a slave after 7 years?
Typically, no. It's better about those laws, but no, in general, no. And I think, again, that sort of gets at the moments where Jewish law would really carefully outline how people who are enslaved should be not perpetually enslaved and not from generation to generation, and that does not seem to pay out. So, really good question. Yeah?
What initially drew you to examine Suriname?
Yeah, so I feel like, wow, we've like latched into Suriname, but so little of my story belongs in Suriname. But I have to say, most of the story came from working on Barbados. So I was working on Barbados in the first book that David had mentioned on Messianism, secrecy, and mysticism. And this family was a little bit too late. That book was mainly before the U.S. Revolutionary War. But later when I came back to be working on the Jewish emancipation debates about whether Jews should have the right to vote in Barbados, I became really interested in Isaac because he was such a key player in that debate. And because I'm obsessed with objects, I also was like, I know this guy because I know his miniature. And it took me, so I would say the miniatures in some way drew me into this story in terms of wanting to know more about the family. In particular, I knew that he had, there was a miniature of a sister named Sarah from New York, but I didn't know if that was the same Sarah that was in the early manumission documents from Barbados, because I don't know if any of you are Sephardic, but people in Sephardic communities reuse names constantly, and so people have the same name again and again and again. So it took about 5 years to prove that was the same person. So I would say in some ways for me, Barbados is more the starting point. That said, I had gone to Suriname, I want to say in 2008 for our Caribbean Studies conference, and we were staying very close to the synagogue that they had gone to, and we ended up going downriver to Yoden Savannah to the ruins. You can still visit them today. They were trying to make it into UNESCO World Heritage Site. I don't know if that's finished, that process, but I would say there is something, particularly if you're interested in objects, there's such a rich material history from that community. And very complex history, as people have picked up on, where there's both this desire to bring people in and to keep people at bay at the same time. So, yeah.
I'm obsessed with education.
Yeah.
So,
same.
I'm fascinated by the fact that Sarah is going from Barbados to Suriname, and then she goes to London.
Yeah.
To boarding school. Well, boarding school costs money.
Yes.
Paying for her education. She manages to go there and to establish herself there. Given that she's exposed to Spanish, Portuguese, maybe some French, a little bit of Hebrew, and not English. So, please elucidate.
Yeah, so this is where, even before her father decides to give her a 10,000-pound dowry and make her the big heiress of her generation, he's paying for that school, and he has a second set of children after their mother dies. He takes up with another woman who he also doesn't marry, and has a second set of children who end up going to the same boarding schools in London, and their older brother Isaac ends up overseeing their education at those boarding schools. So clearly, the father recognizes the importance of education, that he makes their mother promise on his deathbed that they will be Jewishly educated, and he puts Isaac in charge of their education, right? So very much aware as a family that if you want to be part of this inner world education matters, right? That you can't make that kind of leap without some sort of help.
I'm curious what, or if there's still a Jewish community in either of those places, and I guess I'm curious if there is, are they descendants from the people who lived there way back?
So great question. So the Barbados Jewish community, the synagogue, by the 1830s is sort of collapsing as the island's economy collapses. And by the 20th century, by the 1930s, they sold the synagogue to non-Jews, and because there's so few people on the island. Almost immediately, that changes because of the Holocaust. And so we get a huge wave of refugees, not only to Barbados, but to other islands in the Caribbean, of people escaping the Nazis. And so that second wave that comes into the island during the 1930s and goes onward into the 40s and really establishes itself are mainly Ashkenazi Jews. And so they're not familiarly related to that early congregation, but they've really become important stewards of the past. So if you go to Barbados today, there's an amazing museum. They've done incredible archaeology work, of which is really important to the story that I'm telling in various ways. Like, there's a beautiful ritual bath that they uncovered, and all of that has been, and the synagogues, there's a synagogue again, and the synagogue, it's both a museum site and people can have services there. It's mainly a community that goes back and forth from London at this point, and COVID disrupted some of that seasonal status. But so yeah, so a really interesting example of like not related to the early families, but completely good stewards of the history and of the past, and we would not have the history of the island without them, basically, or the Jewish community in the island. The community in Suriname has a slightly different history. Suriname gained its independence in the 1970s, and at that moment, it was very unclear what was happening in Suriname, and a lot of the Jewish community fled to either Amsterdam or to Israel. So there was a big exodus from the community with a very small group of people remaining. But those people were largely descendants of people from that early time period. And so even today, there's members, and then after things settled down in terms of politics in Suriname, you do get people coming back, and they've been slowly building up that community again. So remember I said that the interior of that one synagogue is in Israel. They sold off or rented for 100 years the interior of that synagogue to Israel so that they could put a new roof on that big building that was the Ashkenazi one, and they've rejoined, the congregations have rejoined together. So it's a really good example of like a diminishing community. They know that they have this cultural wealth. They've sort of let somebody else use it for a while so that they could continue as a community, but they haven't lost control of it completely. And if you go to Amsterdam, there's key members of the Amsterdam community are from the Surinese colonial community. I lived there in 2013, and there was I knew quite a large number of people who had ties to that early Surinamese community. That's diminished a little bit as there was a number of anti-Semitic incidents and people left and went to Israel. So.
Do you know what happened to this family after they got to New York?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that was kind of exciting, was to kind of trace what happened with them. So Isaac's side, he only has, I didn't put up his descendants up there, but he has 2 children, only one of whom survives to adulthood, a son. And his son waits until Isaac dies and then marries the girl next door who's not Jewish and converts to become Episcopalian. And so all of the descendants from Isaac are not Jewish to this day, but they became incredibly wealthy, and they had these huge mansions on Fifth Avenue, and country houses and whatnot. So that's the first descendants that I ever met of Sarah and Isaac were through Isaac's line. And then Sarah's family, most of the descendants came through that one marriage to the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Satius. And they spread out, but a lot of them stayed in the New York area, and there's still a number of people living in New York. And then there's a whole nother branch of the family that's around the Bay Area that's from that second marriage or arrangement of their father with the other woman of the people. So, yeah, so I talk a little bit about that in the book, but it's been very interesting of kind of slowly tracking down some of the descendants. You don't want to stalk people, but still interesting. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what kind of source material you had and how you found it?
Yeah, such a good question. So I would say this definitely is a book that it took so long to research and write that I started this long before I started the Art of the Jewish Family book, the one on the 5 objects that 5 women owned. And so it took about 10 years over the course of working on it, from starting researching it till it coming out. And I definitely, some of the chapters are more heavily reliant on objects. There's a core group of objects that were owned by the family that are American Jewish Historical Society. One of the daughters through the Gershom Mendes Satius granddaughter woman, who's the one who's up on the cover. So this woman is the kind of Princess Leia looking woman, is the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Satius. And one of her daughters donates a huge treasure trove of documents to American Jewish Historical Society, including the miniatures. And honestly, I'm not sure how I would have written the story without those. I probably wouldn't, since I was obsessed with the miniatures, probably wouldn't have even started working on it. So a lot of family materials through there. But I would say also that my interest in objects kind of plays out in other chapters too. So when I'm looking at when the family's in New York later, I'm looking for like, where was their house? What descriptions do I have of their house? What objects were in their house? So I'm pretty much, even when we don't have the objects themselves, looking for sources that tell me about those aspects of their lives that interest me, which is kind of the texture of their lives, if that makes any sense, as opposed to just, they move from here to here to here to here. So definitely objects, I would say, continue to play a pretty important role. But in different chapters, I had to rely on different kinds of sources depending on what was available. So for example, the Suriname chapter, I think, was the hardest to write because there was so little about them in Suriname. And so really I ended up having to research many of the other people who were in similar situations in Suriname to get a sense of what their lives would have been like.
What about the ketubah that you mentioned?
The ketubah, so this is another example of why this took like so many years. That ketubah is now located in The Hague. So because these were all former colonies, some stuff's in the colony, but a lot of times documents have gone back to the metropole, so back to whatever the colonial government was. So you'll see things spread all around. I think, gosh, I can't remember how many different countries I went to, but dozens of archives across 3 different continents. So yeah, definitely spread around a lot. We wrapping up, David?
I think, unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. Let me make one quick announcement and then encourage everybody to join us at our reception. In case anybody here is not a member of our mailing list, please go to our website, look us up on Facebook, on social media. We'd love to have you at future events that we'll be holding. The reception, as I said, is around the corner in room 101, and this has been absolutely wonderful. Please join me in thanking
Thank you so much for coming and for inviting me.